Here's part two of chapter four's coverage of discrimination issues in American society for your listening pleasure. This particular part of the lecture is going to deal with discrimination of women, the LGBTQ population, the elderly, and disabled individuals, or persons with disabilities, I should say. There's a number of groups that are not actually addressed, as I mentioned in the very first slide in the last lecture, in this particular chapter, and the treatment of these groups is much shorter than it was when we were talking about race. But many of the same issues that this population has to face relate very directly to the issues that we talked about in regards to discrimination based on race. So you'll hear a few common themes come back. First, we begin with women and sexism. Now, sexism denotes the discrimination and prejudicial treatment of women based solely on their gender and the perceived attributes of their gender. Now, in 2016, Hillary Clinton became the first female to run for president on a major party ticket, and it was thought to be, and historically I'm sure was, a watershed moment. And many inroads were made into the role of women in politics and governance because of that nomination. While it was generally accepted that she was going to win the election, the nation was in large part very surprised by the fact that Donald Trump won the election in 2016 instead. And there have been many theories that her loss has a lot to do with the fact that she was a woman, and sexist attitudes about women being in charge and being in control. And the reaction to her candidacy did seem to expose a dark side in the attitudes about the role of women in politics, and probably contributed to her defeat. You look at some of the issues that took center stage in this election, and for instance, the Republican Party brought out a lot of issues about Planned Parenthood, and I believe there were some issues on ballots and in some of the more local elections or statewide elections to deny funding for Planned Parenthood and those kinds of things. And this, of course, is a women's issue as it is in regards to contraception and women's reproduction rights. Many Planned Parenthood clinics don't even offer abortion, and yet they were seen as abortion facilities, and or an agency that encouraged abortion, and this became a big hot button issue during the election. Again, a very women centered issue that seemed perhaps to surface because there was a woman running for president. Hillary Clinton herself announced her support for abortion rights during her campaign, and many of the Republican, well, I think actually all the Republican candidates at one point or another made the pledge to appoint federal judges that would be opposed to abortion and that were interested in restricting access to contraception, and this all added to the sexist debate in 2016. And indeed, the federal judges that Donald Trump has appointed since his election have all been very much to the right on the issue of contraception and reproductive rights of women. Going back to 1994, during the Bill Clinton administration, the Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act, we call it VAWA, and this act called for a comprehensive approach to domestic violence and sexual assault. Was designed to improve police, prosecutorial, and judicial responses to these issues, arranged for restitution, increased fundings for women's shelters, and instituted a nationwide enforcement of protective orders. In other words, if a protective order was issued in Alaska and the victim went to Washington State would still enforce the protective order of the Alaska courts to give it full faith and credit. Some of the changes that eventually resulted from this, for instance, I know that I remember the Alaska State Trooper Commander talking about the changes in his troops' approach to dealing with domestic violence calls. whereas in the past, when they would enter into a domestic violence situation, they'd send the guy out, the abuser out, to walk around the block and to blow off his steam and to get calmed down, and the trooper would sit down and talk with the woman about what she did to prompt the abuse, what she can do to make sure it didn't happen again, those kinds of things. And he said eventually they came to realize that what they were seeing was murder in slow motion. And because of some of the changes that resulted in the statutes in Alaska, because of the Violence Against Women Act, whenever troopers went to a home and there were visible bruises because of an assault, an arrest had to be made. There was somebody was going to have to go to jail. They couldn't just let the guy take a walk around the block any longer. And so there was more teeth in the law enforcement police actions in regards to DV cases. But still, violence in intimate relationships continues to be a major issue for women. About a quarter of women surveyed recently said that they were raped or physically assaulted by an intimate partner in their lifetime. That's a husband, a boyfriend, a dating partner, something like that. 1 in 4 women said that that had happened. And most estimates say that about 1 in 20 in any 1 year, about 5% of women are physically or sexually assaulted by an intimate partner. Most victimizations, though, we know, are never even reported to law enforcement, so this is just the tip of the iceberg. Maybe only 1 out of 5 rapes, 1 out of 4 physical assaults, and only half of the stalking incidents are reported to law enforcement by most estimates. Now, there's a whole semester class on intimate partner violence, and I hope you have an opportunity to take that class. It's a very important class for anybody who is considering a career in social work, and also involvement in policy issues regarding domestic violence and sexual assault. Poverty has been described as a women's issue, and this notion of the feminization of poverty goes back to somewhere in the 1970s, I believe, and it's become recognized, in fact, that as a valid concept because women hold a larger and larger share of the economic disadvantage in our nation. And this is due to a number of different things. Today, a full-time female worker, the text says, will lose about $434,000 in wages over a 40-year period as in comparison to a male worker. That's how much less a woman would earn. And if she's holding a bachelor's degree or higher, that rises to $713,000 over a 40-year career, almost $250,000 in lost wages, primarily because she's a female. Now, a third of the women have no sick leave and lack basic employee-related benefits, such as health care, for instance. And causes for this feminization of poverty involves a number of different things like desertion or divorce, lack of child support payments by the father of children, low wages, low assistance benefits if the person's not working. Many women, particularly those that are in the marginal employment area, they don't have a position where they can unionize, and so they don't have the advocacy for higher wages and better working conditions. Poor prospects for job advancement, lack of basic benefits, all of these kinds of things are issues that result in an unbalanced way of keeping women in poverty. And in addition to this, women, of course, are the ones who, if there is a child in the relationship and the relationship separates, more times than not, women are the ones who are raising the children. And if there is a couple, women are still considered to be the primary nurturer and caretaker in most of the traditional marriages in America. Now, that there are some more enlightened dynamics in some couples, but by and large, women are looked to be the ones who are supposed to be the caretakers of the kids primarily. And all of these kind of things, put an extra burden on women in terms of their employability and the wages they earn. Also, if it's a single woman, the cost of daycare is just totally crippling in many states. And the text mentions that in New York State, that if a woman is earning minimum wage, that the cost of daycare is half of her salary. Half of her salary. So although there's a belief that women are catching up to men, and in fact, there's been some studies suggesting that women coming out of college, they're graduating from college, I think, more than men, and in the early years of after graduation, they may be earning as much as men, but that falls off after a few years, and so really the wage gap continues, and at this point, women are now earning about 79% of about what a man will earn. That text says that if at the rate of improvement that's been going on in the last couple of decades, it's going to be another 100 years before they reach wage parity. And one of the things that contributes to this, occupational segregation, where women are kind of channeled into particular traditional female jobs, not entirely, of course, but as a group. And these jobs typically are more low paying and in the secondary employment market oftentimes, even in female dominated professions. An example is the social work profession. Years ago, the NASW, I read in the NASW newsletter that said that although 80% of the members of the National Association of Social Workers were female, most of the managerial and supervisory positions among NASW members were held by men. And I thought that was very interesting. 80% were women, and yet still more men were in managerial and supervisory positions in our own profession. In the early years, again, of the Bill Clinton administration, the Family and Medical Leave Act, FEMLA, was signed into law that requires employers with 50 or more employees to offer job protection for family leave up to 12 weeks. This would be after the birth of a child or due to serious illnesses. Then some qualified after a number of days. It qualifies as family medical leave. Time off to take care of a sick relative, child, or an elderly person, those kinds of things. And each parent in a two-parent home has a right to their own 12-week period. Now, Alaska's Family Leave Act is a bit more liberal. I believe it is 18 weeks, not 12. There are a few differences in that, but in Alaska, I think you have an 18-week option. Now, the big drawback to this is that this does not offer pay. This just guarantees that the job will be held for you, or that you'll be able to come back to a similar position when you return to work after the end of your leave. And so if you don't have leave accumulated, like vacation time or something accumulated, or sick leave accumulated, you will not get pay while the time you're off on family medical leave. The United States, as far as maternity leave is concerned, is the only industrialized nation in the world that doesn't offer paid maternity leave. Figure that. And there are other work-related issues for women. Sexual harassment, although it's illegal, is still very common in the workplace, and oftentimes isn't reported for fear of reprisals, but there are federal protections against that. And then also the notion of comparable worth is becoming more into the discussion about wage parity, which is the idea that workers should be paid equally, even if they're in different jobs, if the jobs require the same skill level, education, knowledge, and responsibility. So there's another notion as far as the wage gap is concerned, or wage parity, is this notion of comparable worth. Not necessarily the same job, but jobs that require the same skills and education. Reproductive rights, a big issue, and has been for a long time in our society. Essentially, we live in a patriarchal society. We have a lot of mostly older men making laws about women and their sexuality and their rights to reproduce and or not. And there are a number of there's some just as an intellectual aside, some interesting theories about why it is that men have this idea that they should control women's sexuality, and I think Randall Collins is a sociologist who wrote an article about that. And if you ever find the article, it's a very interesting thing to read. But his theory is basically that it goes back to the whole notion of the agrarian economy and everything, and that women produced children, and children were essentially economic assets during the farming. Now they're economic burdens largely, but in the olden days when we were still an agrarian economy, children were economic assets more and more and more. And so a landowner, it was to the landowner's benefit to have a lot of children, and therefore he more or less had the belief that he had the rights, a property right to his woman who was producing the children, and also to the children for that matter. Now that it's more complicated than that and much more involved than that particular superficial explanation, but there are some roots to this notion that men should have control over women's sexuality that are tied into kind of old time and no longer valid, if they ever were valid to begin with, concepts about well, economics. And it's always about economics. The dollar always has something to do with what we do. So some of the, just in the last 30 or 40 years, some of the major events, I suppose you would say, in terms of reproductive rights for women. Of course, we go back to Roe versus Wade in 1973 that legalized abortion on demand during the first trimester across the United States, and I believe gave the states the capacity to determine abortion rights in the second trimester as well. But in the first trimester, it was abortion on demand across the United States. But there have been literally hundreds of bills introduced almost immediately after its passage trying to restrict abortion through constitutional amendments, and they haven't gotten very far. But there is this push that is, going to continue in the society. In 1977, Henry Hyde, I believe, was a representative from, I want to say, Illinois. The Hyde Amendment passed. Congress denied federal funding for abortions except for saving the life of the mother. Later amended to include promptly reported cases of rape and incest. So this basically denies Medicaid payments for abortions for poor women. Now this was upheld. It was challenged and upheld by the court in Harris versus McRae in 1980. But in 1981, the Reagan administration reduced or rolled back some of this approval again and restricted funding only to save the life of the mother. There has been, even as abortions have become legal, there's been a dramatic drop in federally funded abortions. It's not surprising since the 1970s, but the number of abortions on the whole has also decreased quite a bit in the last few decades. In 1991, Rust versus Sullivan allowed the prohibition of federal funds for family planning programs that give out information on abortion. In other words, Rust versus Sullivan, the Supreme Court instituted a gag rule that said that federal funds could be withheld from any family planning program that gave out information on abortions. They weren't allowed to talk about abortions in family planning clinic. And I think the text said on the second day of the Bill Clinton administration, he signed an order overturning the gag rule in 1993. And in 94, during the Clinton years, again, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act expanded civil liberties by guaranteeing unobstructed access to abortion or reproductive health services clinics. Note that all of this is, in the Clinton years at least, is occurring in 93 and 94, and there's going to be some other acts that you're going to see early in his administration that were, really left-leaning and supportive of civil rights and those kinds of things for women and other oppressed groups. During those years, he had a Democratic Congress. It was his first 2 years in office, but in 1994 was the big, they called it the Republican Revolution. In the midterm, his first term, the midterm elections, the Republicans took control of both houses, and Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House. And we talked about this in a previous lecture. Began to institute some very harsh, very right-wing kinds of policies about, a number of different social issues. And so some of the liberalism of the first 2 years of the Clinton administration, including that push for national health insurance that failed, really kind of died out after that as Clinton began to deal with the need to deal with a very Republican Congress and an increasingly conservative political atmosphere. Since the time, and this is continuing into this day, there are all sorts of restrictions from state to state that really are intended to chip away at abortion rights and to put restrictions on it so that it becomes very difficult to accomplish. Texas was putting restrictions on what kind of clinic, what kind of license had to be in place to perform an abortion, even if it wasn't a medical procedure per se. There's just a whole number of different things. In Indiana, we're going to talk about another thing in Indiana in a moment, but Indiana governor, when Mike Pence was still governor of Indiana before he became vice president, signed legislation that I think, if I remember correctly, it required that aborted fetuses have a funeral, be buried, and that the tissues not be used for any sort of research or those that stem cell research or anything like that, I believe. Now that was being challenged in court, and I believe that the courts declared that to be unconstitutional. I'm not sure, but again, it gives you a flavor of what is going on in especially because so many of the legislatures around the nation right now are held, are controlled by Republicans and conservatives, and there are many efforts to make it very difficult for women to access their rights to an abortion if they wish to pursue one. 2015. And one of the things, by the way, is mentioned here. Personhood amendments. So there's a recent strategy also where their state legislatures are considering declaring that life begins at conception, and I believe some states have already done that, which in effect turns abortion into murder, which many of the pro-life persons and organizations and churches, of course, maintain that's what it is. But it's a very difficult issue, and our society is struggling a great deal with this issue. I believe, as it's pretty obvious. And despite the fact that Americans are voting in conservative thinkers in regards to these issues, half of them say they're pro-choice. They consider themselves to be pro-choice, and only 44% consider themselves to be pro-life. So I don't understand that. I suppose that means the pro-choice people just aren't voting. Well, there are other things that we'll be touching on that might explain that as well. Internationally, there are all sorts of indignities and horrors that women have to suffer in many different societies, and I'm just going to touch on these. These are ones that I think you're familiar with, like, for instance, the female genital mutilation. It's a procedure that has absolutely no health benefits whatsoever, and can indeed cause a whole host of very serious physical problems, lifelong problems, in fact. And it is practiced in many of the traditional societies in the Middle East, I guess, and in Africa, but is also practiced among some immigrant groups in some of the industrialized nations. I believe there's even some indications that it has occurs sometimes in the United States. And really, this is a procedure that's primarily focused on the control of women's sexuality by males. Women have their freedom of movement restricted in many societies. They're not allowed to leave the home or to have contact with other males other than their husbands or very close male relatives, and much less be able to drive or to travel out of the country. Children in some societies legally belong to the father, which keeps the mother under control, of course. There is the notion of honor killings, where if a woman participates in some activity that is seen to soil the reputation of the husband or the family, they can actually kill the woman legally, and this behaviors include such things as not agreeing to or participating in a marriage that isn't an arranged marriage, for instance, or being seen with other men other than the person that they've been designated to be married to, those kinds of things. Women in many societies are excluded from government and public life, from working, from attending school, must wear full body coverage and veils in many societies, lack access to medical care. The text points out that male doctors in some societies aren't allowed to provide any treatment for women, and because women are denied access to education, there aren't women to treat women, and so therefore a lot of times women just don't have the right kind of any medical care to speak of. And then the issue of human trafficking as well for sexual purposes or involuntary servitude, and this is an issue that extends into Alaska. In fact, I believe there have been some indications of human trafficking going on through the Anchorage airport, in fact, from one time or another. Moving on to the LGBTQ community, this community has seen a lot of social advances over the last few decades. There's one wonders. I believe I fear for the permanence of some of these changes as increasingly our courts become more and more conservatively minded, and our leadership is seeing to it that more and more of the federal judges are conservatives. We'll see what happens with this, but here's a bit of a mini history on this. Of course, the history of the gay rights movement, I mean, can be divided into, 2 or 3 different kinds of periods of time. But I think the time of activism began in the 1960s at the Stonewall riots, where the police raided a gay bar in New York City one night, and there were demonstrations and riots following that, and that's sort of when the gay community began to stand up for itself. In 1960, every state in the Union had laws that said that sodomy was, even between consenting adults, was still a federal level crime. I'm sorry, a felony crime, that should say. Let me just go ahead and change this. I'll just not pretend that felony level crime. Oh, hit the right keys. Felony level crime. There. In '93, the American Psychological Association, American Psychological Association, APA, Psychological Association, removed homosexuality as a psychiatric disorder in the DSM-3. Prior to that time, it was seen as a disturbance, but after that, it was seen as a more or less of a life choice, even if it was outside the norm. It was nonetheless no longer considered a psychiatric disorder. In the following year, the Bill Clinton implemented the "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" policy in the U.S. military. Now, he had made promises to open up the military for gays and lesbians, but had a lot of pressure from the right in his efforts to do that, and wound up with this compromise, which basically said that, just like it explains, that the recruiters were not allowed to ask about a person's sexual orientation, because previously, if they indicated they were homosexual, they would not be allowed to serve in the military. And so, as long as the recruiters were not supposed to ask, the drill sergeants were not supposed to ask, and as long as the person didn't say they were gay or say they wanted to have sex with somebody of the same sex, that kind of thing, they could stay in the military. But basically what that meant was that, of course, gay and lesbians had to, stay under the radar and stay in the closet. Lawrence versus Texas in 2003, Texas's laws against sodomy were struck down by the United States Supreme Court, and that extended to all the states in the nation. And then in 2008, state courts, by 2008, I said state courts began to strike down laws limiting marriage rights. Massachusetts and California, and I believe Hawaii were some of the earliest. Vermont were some of the earliest states to begin to either give LGBTQ people the right to marry, or to at least have a civil union, which was not a marriage, but it was a step in that direction. 2009, the Matthew Shepard Act expanded federal hate crime laws to include crimes um, because of gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. If you're not familiar with the Matthew Shepard story, he is a young gay man that was murdered in Wyoming in the late 1990s, I recall, um, by by two guys who met him in a bar and just murdered because he was gay. There's an excellent movie documentary about about that event called the Matt Shepard Was a Friend of Mine, and there are a couple movies on Matthew Shepard, but Matt Shepard Was a Friend of Mine is the movie I'm talking about. It's an excellent documentary if you want to learn more about this incident. But in fact, the film ends with President Obama signing the Matthew Shepard Act, or it's near the end at least of the movie. The Obama administration in 2011 repealed the "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" policy and made it permissible for gays and lesbians to uh, be gay and lesbian and acknowledge that while they were in the military. But once again, the individual states began to buck the federal trends and the federal laws. There's a lot of resentment about the socially liberal ideas of the Obama administration. I think a lot of that had to do not only with his political leanings, but also with his race. But that is just a feeling that we had, I think, during that time. But in any event, Arizona passed the right to discriminate law that allowed businesses to discriminate against gays and lesbians. But this was vetoed by the governor, not because she disagreed with it so much, I think, as because she just had a lot of political pressure to not allow it to go through, not to sign the bill. But a year later, in Indiana, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, was signed by Mike Pence as governor. That allowed businesses to claim religious beliefs prevent them from serving LGBTQ customers. The issue that brought it to the legislature's attention was a bakery in South Bend that refused to a baker refused to bake a cake for a gay couple that was wedding, and they sued, and this whole thing followed up, and this law resulted. There was a big outcry nationally. Many organizations, including the NCAA, threatened to withdraw their events from Indianapolis, and that kind of thing is a very big deal in Indiana. It's the crossroads of America, it says, and Indianapolis at least. And so anyway, under intense economic pressure, again, economics, the dollar comes into play here. The legislature kind of softened the wording on that some, and Governor Pence kind of backed off of that some. He was actually considering running for president himself until this thing happened. I think he came out of it not looking very good, and decided not to run, and instead ran for a second term governor, and was looking very much like he might not get reelected when Donald Trump pulled him out of the fire and made him his running mate. 2015, Oberg fell versus Hodges was the case in the United States Supreme Court. Struck down state laws prohibiting same-sex marriage and requiring the states to recognize each other's marriage license nationwide. 37 states, including Alaska, had already legalized same-sex marriage by that time, but this ruling made it legal nationally and removed the question. Now, assuming that doesn't someday get overturned, and again, I wouldn't stop worrying about that, the way the courts are going to be for quite some time now. But that's how it stands at present time. And here's an example of why I say we might want to worry a little bit. The Trump administration in 2018 made the decision they were going to ban transgendered people from the military. And I believe actually the people that were currently serving were going to have to leave service, if I'm not mistaken. There were a number of lower court rulings that blocked the implementation of that, but in January 2019, the Supreme Court removed those blocks and it has allowed the Trump administration to move forward with its ban on transgendered persons in the military. And even though there had, other than some, the ups and downs again, of course, some rollbacks again of civil rights. Really, even in some states and municipalities, there's still very little. Well, there's only protections against discrimination by private employers in just a handful of states and cities. So. Nonetheless, this community has grown stronger politically since the 1960s, and in 1984, the Democratic Party even included a gay rights plank in its platform. But as I say, progress is in fits and starts. Results are mixed, particularly if you go from state to state and city to city. But here are the latest information that I have, at least in terms of Alaska. The same-sex sexual activity has been legal since 1980. Same-sex couples have had the right to marry since October of 2014, so that's, I think, 6, 7, 8 months ahead of the Supreme Court ruling. But the state offers very few legal protections on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, so the population remains vulnerable to employment, housing, and public accommodations discrimination. Although discrimination against the state employees because of their sexual orientation is illegal. Anchorage, back in the early 2000s, I believe, had a plebiscite about equal protection for gays in employment and housing that was defeated, I think, originally. It was really a sad moment, I thought. But since that time, the Anchorage Assembly established protections for the LGBTQ community and anti-discrimination ordinances and those kinds of things. There was a movement afoot in 2018, Proposition 1, to strip protections for transgendered individuals in Anchorage, which was rejected by the Anchorage voters. Of course, a lot of the discrimination against this population relates to homophobia, and it's really been amplified by the AIDS crisis since the early days of the epidemic in the early 1980s. This came to the surface in the early years of the Reagan administration, and it's been said that Ronald Reagan never once mentioned AIDS in any speeches, any public statements, or writings throughout the entire 8 years he was in office. There just was well, first of all, people didn't really understand it. It was seen as a gay disease, and the moral majority had a very strong voice in those years, and Reagan felt very pressured by them as well. But in general, the public just kind of blamed the gays for this and didn't want to deal with it. It seemed. Evidenced by Jesse Helms, who's the senator from North Carolina. He was once a Democrat, became a Republican many years before this, and introduced a bill to prevent the Center for Disease Control from using AIDS education funds in ways that would foster homosexuality, whatever that meant. There was concern for the AIDS HIV crisis increasing after the disease became prevalent in the heterosexual community. So when it began to affect everybody, then all of a sudden people became concerned about it. And at this point, about 1.2 million Americans are living with an HIV infection. And it says that about 1 in 8 of these persons are unaware of their infection. There are efforts to eliminate homosexuality, with conversion therapies, for instance, just a few states have banned conversion therapies for minors. Other states are permitting it, and basically a parent can send their child off to a camp or therapy that's going to, I think, how did the text put it? Pray the gay out of them or something along those lines. Or not only that, but there are a number of different techniques that are being used for this conversion therapy, which the APA says here, announced that is possibly harmful as well as ineffective. Historically, since the Bill Clinton years, I mean, that administration was very erratic in its support for the community, but mandated that federal agencies add sexual orientation to affirmative action policies. The Bush administration rolled back some of these protections. I believe the Obama administration added some of those protections back so that affirmative action policies do cover LGBT members. But the Trump administration, and really Obama was very slow in coming around in support of the gay community, and came out in favor of same-sex marriage only in his second term. A little bit ahead of the Supreme Court rulings, but really took some time getting to that place where he was ready to support them openly. The Trump administration has promised to protect this group during its campaign, but has done very little. In fact, has begun to roll back some rights in its first 2 years as well. If you belong to the LGBTQ community, the textbook points out you're probably better off in terms of your civil rights and your liberties in Europe, where there are more protections and guarantees of equality. And in fact, the EU codes dictate that member states proactively fight discrimination. So, a slide or two about the elderly and ageism. This is a youth-oriented culture, and our culture loves the young and the restless, and elderly individuals are seen as a burden. And in most traditional societies around the world, and in Eastern societies as well, the elderly are revered and respected, and in fact maintain control of decisions in families, even as their children have children of their own. Some of that has to do with the fact that the elderly are the ones in the traditional societies in particular that own the land, and so they have a lot of control. But in industrialized societies, land isn't so much the issue. It's information and skills and education and those things. And particularly in the information age, where things are changing so rapidly, the youth are the ones that have the power in so many respects as far as information is concerned, and the elderly is seen as kind of being out of sync with all of that. So, rather than offering reverence for their wisdom and experience, the elderly are often viewed as being deficient and unprotected. But the population of those over 62 is increasing and is expected to double by 2060. Medical treatment, the advances in medical science has increased life expectancy, but even though we're living longer, disabilities and illnesses, chronic illnesses, continue and become a major issue as we get older. And so the health industry is going to be taxed I don't mean taxed fiscally, I mean burdened, let's say, whatever the term is, in having to find ways to care for these individuals as they grow older and live longer. And so there's a trend is likely to be increasing healthcare costs as time goes along. And as it is at present time, our leaders are already fussing about the fact that Medicare is such a big portion of the federal budget, and there's concern about its long-term solvency as well as the Social Security. Now, poverty rate for those over 65 has decreased really pretty dramatically since the 1950s. Again, I think largely because of Social Security and Medicare implementation. But mind you again that If you're an elderly woman, I think you're something like twice as likely to be poor than if you're a elderly male. And just about everyone of retirement age is eligible for Medicare, and a few people younger than that for with particular a couple of particular diseases and illnesses. But there are some persons, if you didn't work in a job where you paid into the Medicare fund, where while you're still offered Medicare, you have to pay extra premiums for that coverage. Everybody pays for Part B, which is the doctor's visits, outpatient visits, and things like that. You pay a premium for that based on your income. But Part A is free, and that is funded out of federal funds. Part B is funded more from I think from the individual premiums than federal funding or whatever. So yeah, the long and short of it is that we can expect that more pressure is going to be put on family members to provide care or pay for it at least, particularly for in-home and long-term care needs. The last group we're going to look at is persons with disabilities and the notion of otherism. Um, the text says, there are ways that we traditionally define disability have to do with things that persons aren't or can't do. So if they have a chronic illness, they're not healthy. If they're unable to work, they're not productive. If they have functional limitations where they can't, perform the daily tasks that we all need to perform, then they're not capable. But a more recent model about disability, and this is the one I think that is kind of more strengths based, is based upon the psychosocial model that sees disability as socially defined. That is, that persons with disabilities are a minority group, that the poverty and the other social ills that they deal with are the result of discrimination, not because of any inadequacy on their part. That the problem exists in the interaction of the individual with the social environment, and I would add the physical environment as well. So that how does society accommodate individuals with disabilities is the question more than that what is it that the person can't do. And so it's really not a personal problem based on that person's deficiency. It's instead a challenge to society that requires society to make adjustments for the disabled individual or the individual with disabilities. When you say a disabled person, you define the person by the disability, and it's one of those old habits that I still remind myself to be careful about. The big dividing line here for persons with disabilities was 1990 when George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disability Act, the ADA, which extended civil rights coverage to them and including protections against discrimination in private sector employment and public accommodations, as well as all federal federal situations. And it requires employers to make what are known as reasonable accommodations for an employee with a disability. Um, so that if a job could be reasonably performed by the person that has the disability, but for a lack of access to the office or something along those lines, then the employer is required to make those accommodations so that the person can perform the job. Still, stigmatization, discrimination, oppression exist with this population. Their poverty rate disproportionately high. The median household income of a person that has a person with disabilities was 61% of the income of a home without a member with disability. Now, stop and look at that for a moment, because it doesn't say that a person with disability earns 61% of what a person without a disability does. Households with that person. So that would mean there may be other adults in the home that are also working and performing, in the job. But the total household income is 61% of the household income without a person with disability. So that tells you something about how great the financial burden can be on these individuals. Depending upon their employment history and the nature of their disability, they may be less likely to have adequate health insurance, so they tend to pay more for medical care than the rest of the population does. And their need for medical care is greater. And buildings still continue to be built without, accommodations for individuals. Looking at, I have an older brother who walks with a cane and is having increasing difficulties with mobility. He has an elderly friend in his late 80s who also walks with a cane, and we're looking at taking a train trip together. And the train station here in north of Fort Wayne, as well as the one in Toledo to the east and the one in Michigan City, Indiana to the west, that's outside Chicago, all three of those have ramps up to the platform where you board the train, but they don't have what's called a high platform, so the train sits higher than the platform. And so they have to be helped up into the train in order to ride the train. They can't get there themselves. And I guess Amtrak gets away with that by saying that they have people who will help them up into the train, but they should have high platforms so that they can access the train themselves. And that's an example, I think, of some of the fact that just some of the things that I've actually noticed about discrimination of persons with relatively speaking, fairly mild disabilities. When we look at the last couple slides here, we're almost done. Just really about discrimination at large in our society, and what have been some of the remedies for discrimination. Go back to 1896 in the Supreme Court's ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson. It was the separate but equal doctrine that said that, and this was about train travel, as I recall. That was what the case was about. Said that it was okay for them to have a separate car for blacks as long as the car was of equal to the car that white people rode in, so that whites could still travel and not be troubled by having a black person in the same car with them, as long as the two cars had equal accommodations. So separate was fine as far as that court ruling was concerned, as long as they were equal facilities. Okay. In 1954, the Earl Warren Court overturned that finding. It's a long time. That's like almost 60 years later. In Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, it said by definition, separate could not be equal, and so it ordered, among other things, the desegregation. This was particularly about schools, and so it ordered the desegregation of schools. The schools were slow to respond to that, and this is where that de jure law, where something is implemented in statute, but de facto law is what's actually being implemented, and de jure law and de facto implementation oftentimes are very different things, and certainly during this era between Brown versus Topeka and today, even the implementation, the de facto segregation had continued for many years after the original court rulings. And so in 1971, in the Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board ruling, the Supreme Court mandated busing to achieve racial integration in school districts that had a history of segregation. So this was a very controversial decision that created ire among the white middle class segments, and created quite a bit of chaos in the civil rights issues through the 1980s, even until that finally settled down. The civil rights movement really challenged the systems that weren't implementing federal law, and usually schools, but also places of public accommodation. You know, um, you know, Rosa Parks and refusing to go to the back of the bus, and the group that refused to get up from the counter at the Woolworths, in I forget what city it was, somewhere in the South Birmingham, I believe. The Freedom Riders, riding buses through the South, that oftentimes wouldn't permit blacks to, to ride those buses, those kinds of things. So all these challenges were there to bring the attention to the public of the fact that the law had changed, but practices had not changed, particularly in the Deep South. Federal Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts followed in 1964, 65, and 68. And many of the civil rights we refer to now in earlier in this lecture kind of go back to the Civil Rights Act, particularly of 1964. But recently, the courts and the Trump administration in particular have begun to pull back on some of these protections, particularly in voting rights. There have been issues in areas like North Carolina, for instance, where there were efforts made to. It's pretty clear that there was gerrymandering going on, and efforts really to restrict the African American vote in that state, and in other states, not only in the South. And so voter registration laws, voter ID laws is another thing that has been very controversial as well. And so there are still a lot of struggles around this. And instead of responding by closer supervision, the Supreme Court has actually allowed some of those states that were under the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s required to report to the federal government about how they were doing with voting rights, for instance. The federal government has lifted those restrictions now, so the states aren't being supervised any longer. And there's a lot of concern about what that's going to mean in the long run, particularly given what we're seeing around the nation in terms of access to voting rights. One other remedy for discrimination is the affirmative action policies, and we have a group assigned to study affirmative action, and we're going to hear a little bit more about this later in the semester from that group. But this is intended, this is a federal policy. It goes back actually, I think, to the Kennedy administration. It's intended to ensure admission, hiring, and promotions of women and minorities in direct relation to their numbers of the population. This gives preference to minorities and females by design, but the issue is to correct past wrongs done to those groups that really keeps them out of the mainstream. We're trying to level the playing field with affirmative action policies. The Obama, I believe that the Clinton administration, if I remember correctly, added LGBTQ or gays and lesbians at least to the not. I don't know if transsexuals were included, but gays and lesbians were added to the protections of affirmative action in federal level. And I think the Bush administration, that's some of the things that they rolled back. And so President Obama was trying to get the Congress to act on this and didn't. And so he issued an executive order extending protections to the transsexual population as well. Now, the problem with executive orders is that it just takes the stroke of the pen of the next president to change that. And so as near as I can tell, I haven't noticed that President Trump has done anything about that, but I'd keep watch on it. Now, the idea about affirmative action, most people think is about quotas, and you'll hear all these stories, these anecdotes about how they had a friend who applied, and because there was an Alaska Native, he didn't do as well in the interview, but they hired him because he was Alaska Native. That is illegal. You can't use race as the only selecting factor for a job or admissions or anything like that. Now, an exception to this is the Alaska Native tribes can do preferential hiring of members of their own tribe. That's a separate issue. But in terms of most hiring practices, quotas are illegal. Now, race can be considered as a factor among other factors as well. It can't be the only factor, but the courts have ruled that it can be. Gender or race conscious, gender is another issue. Gender or race conscious policies that are flexible and do not exclude other groups are legal and is one form of affirmative action. Affirmative action also involves outreach to minority communities, to recruit individuals to apply for jobs or to advise people of the availability of jobs, because a lot of jobs in industry, or or the availability is communicated by word of mouth, and that means that we talk to people who are like us. And so if there are primarily white people in an industry, uh, word of mouth is going to spread to other white people and not into the inner cities, let's say, or to to the Hispanic community down the road or something like that. And so affirmative action can be getting those outreach efforts to reach into those communities. The state of Alaska has a policy. I believe it's still, at least at one time it was, where underutilized populations, the state would look at the number of individuals, or percentage of individuals from minority populations that had been hired, and if there weren't enough to match the percentage of the population, then when we interviewed persons for jobs, we were to interview all people from underutilized populations, interview them. That didn't say we had to hire them if they weren't qualified, but we were obligated to offer interviews. Another example of a affirmative action policy. So it's not about quotas. Uh, if you have somebody telling you that they were passed over because a black guy applied for the job, and or a native individual got it, but they weren't qualified, somebody doesn't know about their own qualifications, is my guess. It isn't that simple. But there's always going to be this argument about reverse discrimination, and there's really a lot of pushes to repeal affirmative action altogether. And the courts certainly have rolled back some of the protections offered by affirmative action. The Backey decision, I believe, in I want to say 1978. Um, it was one decision. There was another one involving the University of Michigan. The University of Texas has been involved in some affirmative action cases recently as well. So keep your ears to the news, and you'll hear that this is a very current issue these days. I believe that affirmative action is still very much necessary. I mean, just look at all the statistics we've been talking about in the last two lectures, and where minority populations, all these minority populations stand in terms of employment and economics, and those kinds of things. It's clear indication that this is not an equal society, and minority groups are still denied equal access to the rights and privileges that all Americans should have. I'm off my soapbox. That's the end of this lecture, and I hope you found it helpful.